One day before the blizzard, she buried a fire's breath. Elias Torvik, who had pulled dead settlers from frozen sod houses across 5 Dakota winters, told her plain, "Waste a day on that ditch, girl, and the storm takes you before spring sees your bones." She had $14, no kin past Minnesota, and no way to cut the 6 cords every neighbor said she needed. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped more than 50 degrees in 5 hours. But 4 months earlier, Ragna Solheim had never fired clay or sealed a pipe joint in her life. She had arrived in Dakota Territory in August of 1887 with her father's hand on her shoulder and $41 sewn into the lining of a wool coat 2 sizes too large. 4 months was not enough time to learn what the prairie demanded. It was barely enough time to understand the question. Her father, Halvor Solheim, had filed his claim near the De Smet settlement in the spring of that year. He was a carpenter by training and an optimist by nature, and he had promised Ragna that by first snowfall they would have walls, a stove, and enough wood stacked to see March. He died in October, 8 weeks before the solstice, when the front axle of a borrowed freight wagon split on a rutted supply road and the load crushed his chest before he could roll clear. 2 men from the settlement hauled his body back on the same broken wagon. Ragna watched them come up the track from the doorway of a cabin that had no door. She was 16 years old. She had no relatives west of Minnesota and none east of Norway. The claim was in her father's name. If she left it unoccupied through winter, the filing would lapse, the land would revert, and everything Halvor Solheim had spent his last year building would become lumber for someone else's barn. The settlement buried him on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the women had already begun suggesting she take a position in town, kitchen work, laundry, minding children for a merchant family. Each suggestion carried the same quiet certainty that a girl alone on a quarter section in winter was not a homesteader, but a body waiting to be found. Ragna refused. She refused politely at first, and then simply by not answering. She stayed on the claim. What she had: a 12 by 14 shack with tarred felt over rough planed planks, gaps at every seam where her father had not yet finished chinking. One iron box stove that had cost $11 in Huron and arrived with a crack along the ash box door that Halvor had sealed with stove cement 3 days before he died. One bedstead, 2 wool blankets, one of them patched with flour sacking, a milk goat that had survived the journey from Minnesota by being too stubborn to sicken, a cracked sled with one sound runner, and $14 hidden in a flour sack behind the stove, the remainder of everything Halvor had earned, borrowed, and saved. She had roughly 1.25 cords of fuel. Some of it was proper wood, hauled from a creek bottom stand 6 miles east. The rest was twisted hay and dried dung she had gathered herself in September while her father was still alive and laughing about how the prairie made everyone equal in what they burned. She needed 6 cords to survive until April. She had no horse, no ox, no wagon, and no way to get one. She had no credit at the mercantile. She had the strength of a girl who had worked hard her whole life but had never swung an axe for 8 hours in freezing air. That was the arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not work. Elias Torvik came to the claim on the 3rd day after the burial. He was 61 years old, Norwegian-born, and he had freighted mail and supplies across Dakota Territory for 5 winters. He had pulled a dead woman and 2 dead children from a sod house near Redfield in 1884, and the experience had not made him gentle. It had made him precise. He did not knock. The shack had no door yet. Halvor had hung a canvas sheet weighted with stones, so Torvik pushed it aside and stepped in without invitation. He stood in the middle of the single room and turned a slow circle, his breath pluming white even though the stove was lit. He looked at the walls. He pressed his thumb against a seam where daylight showed through the felt. He kicked the base of the stove and listened to the rattle. He crouched and held his bare hand flat against the floor, 6 inches from the boards, and held it there for 10 seconds. Then he stood and looked at Ragna. "You have half a winter house." Torvik said. Your walls will pass wind. Your floor has no seal underneath. Your stove has a cracked box that will widen before February. He pointed at the stacked fuel near the back wall. That is maybe a cord and a half. You need 6, and that number assumes your walls do not drink the heat first, which they will. Ragna said nothing. She already knew the numbers. Hearing them from Torvik's mouth did not make them worse. It made them real. You have 3 choices, Torvik continued. He counted them on fingers scarred from decades of handling frozen harness leather. Haul more wood. You have no team and no money for a team. Bank sod against the walls. You have no sod cutter, and the ground is already going hard. Or leave the claim and take a bed in town before the first real blow. I am not leaving, Ragna said. Torvik studied her. He did not look angry. He looked like a man watching someone step onto river ice in November and calculating how far they would get. Your father was a good man and a fair carpenter, Torvik said, but he built for summer. This cabin will kill you in January the way it sits. Then I will change the way it sits, Ragna said. Torvik shook his head. He reached into his coat and set $2 silver on the stovetop. For the burial cost, he said. Halvor would have done the same for me. He left without saying goodbye. Ragna picked up the coins. $16 now. The number meant nothing against 6 cords of wood, but it meant she could eat for another week while she figured out how to not die. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time since her father's death. Ragna fed the stove until the pipe glowed dull red above the collar. The upper half of the cabin grew warm enough to unbutton her coat. The lower half, the floor, the bedstead, the space where her body actually lived, stayed cold enough to see her breath. She lay under both blankets and watched the stove glow through the dark. She could feel it. A thin, constant river of air moving across the floor, sliding over her face where she lay, cold as creek water. The stove was pulling. It was eating the air inside the room, and the room was replacing it by sucking winter through every seam and crack and gap her father had not yet sealed. The fire was not losing to the cold. The fire was helping the cold get in. She did not sleep. She lay with her feet numb and her mind turning, and sometime before dawn she remembered something her father had shown her when she was 9 years old in a rented room in Christiania before the crossing. He had held a candle near the base of a coal stove and told her to watch the flame. It bent sideways, dragged toward the stove's draft. See that? He had said. A fire eats air before it eats fuel, and the air has to come from somewhere. She had not understood then. She understood now. She understood it in her ankles and her knees, and the ache in her fingers where they gripped the blanket edge. The stove was a thief. It stole warm air, sent it up the pipe, and left the room to pay the debt by importing cold air through every flaw in the walls. The more she fed the fire, the harder the room pulled. More wood would not fix this. More wood would make it worse. The next morning, Ragna walked the outside of the cabin with a lit twist of hay. She held it near every seam, every nail hole, every place where felt met plank. The smoke bent inward at 11 separate points, 11 leaks, 11 rivers of cold that the stove's draft was pulling through the walls, faster than the fire could warm them. She sat on the cracked sled and stared at the cabin. Her father had built the walls. She could not rebuild them. She could chink them, mud, moss, cloth, anything, and she would, but chinking only slowed infiltration. It did not change the fundamental problem. The stove needed air, and it would find it. What if she gave the stove air from somewhere else? Not from the room, not from the wind, from somewhere warmer. She thought about cellars. She thought about the well pit her father had started and abandoned when he hit clay at 4 feet. She thought about how the bottom of that pit had felt different from the surface, not warm exactly, but not killing, like the ground was holding a different season at arm's length below. She had heard men talk about frost depth. Torvik himself had mentioned it once, warning settlers to set posts deep or lose them to heaving. The frost went down 4 feet in a normal winter, 5 in a hard one. But below that? Below the frost line, the ground did not freeze. It held steady, year-round, at a temperature that felt like autumn even when the air above was January. What if she ran a pipe underground long enough and deep enough for the earth to take the edge off the air and fed that tempered air directly to the stove? The stove would still eat air, but it would eat air that had traveled through 50 feet of ground instead of air that had just crossed the open prairie at 20 below zero. The room would stop paying the stove's debt in cold. The fire's heat would stay where she needed it, at body level, at floor level, where the killing happened. It was not a theory. It was a pipe in the ground, simple as a well. Simpler because it did not need to find water, but she had no pipe. She had no money for pipe. She had no labor. She had no time. She had clay. Her father's abandoned well pit sat 30 feet from the cabin's east wall. He had stopped digging because the clay was too dense for a hand auger, but dense clay was exactly what pipe needed to be. If she could dig a trench 6 feet deep, form clay sections, fire them hard enough to hold, seal the joints, and connect one end to the stove's draft box and the other to an intake above the snow line, she might change the equation. Might. The word sat in her chest like a stone. She had never laid pipe. She had never fired clay. She had never sealed a heating system. She had watched her father build, and she had handed him tools, and she had listened. That was all she had. It would have to be enough. Ragna began digging on a cold morning in late October. The surface was frozen to the depth of a handspan. Below that, the ground yielded grudgingly in clods that had to be pried loose and thrown clear. She used her father's spade, the only good tool she owned, and she marked her trench line with twine staked at both ends. 50 feet, 6 feet deep. She calculated the volume in her head and stopped calculating because the number made her want to sit down and not get up. She dug instead. By the second day, Marta Bell came. Marta was 32, widowed 2 years, mother of a boy named Nels, who was 7, and already old enough to carry water. She lived on the next claim east, close enough to hear hammering on a quiet day. She was not unkind. She was practical in the way that widows on the prairie were practical, which meant she did not waste words on comfort when information was more useful. She stood at the edge of Ragna's trench, which was, at that point, 8 feet long and 3 feet deep, and looked down. "What are you digging?" Marta asked. "A pipe run," Ragna said. She did not stop shoveling. "A pipe run to where?" "To the stove." Marta considered this. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the trench. She looked at the pile of clay-heavy spoil growing beside it. "Even if the earth is warmer down there than the air up here," Marta said, "how much warmer? Warm enough to matter?" It was the right question. Ragna had asked it herself. She climbed out of the trench, walked to her father's well pit, and knelt at the edge. "Come here," she said. "Put your hand in." Marta knelt beside her. They both reached down into the pit, past the frozen crust, past the hard layer, into the clay that Halvor had cursed for being too dense. At 4 feet, the ground was stiff. At 5 feet, it softened. Marta held her hand at the bottom of the pit and frowned. "It is not warm," Marta said. "It is not January," Ragna replied. "Feel the difference between your hand down there and your face up here." Marta felt it. The air on her cheeks was sharp enough to sting. The clay against her palm was cold, but it was a different cold, dense, stable, without the bite of wind. The difference was perhaps 30 degrees, perhaps more. "Now think about air being pulled through 50 feet of that," Ragna said. "Not heated, just tempered, just brought closer to something a stove can work with instead of fighting raw wind." Marta withdrew her hand and wiped clay on her skirt. She did not say it would work. She did not say it would fail. She said, "You need pipe sections, and you have no money for pipe." "I have clay," Ragna said. The same clay that stopped my father's well. You have never fired clay. No. And if the sections crack or the joints leak or the whole thing freezes solid the first hard night, then I will have wasted time I could not afford, Ragna said. But I cannot cut and haul 6 cords alone, Marta. I cannot. The math does not work. If I spend every hour on firewood, I might get 3 cords by December, and 3 cords through these walls will not last February. This is the only other answer I can find. Marta stood up. She brushed her knees. She looked at Ragna for a long moment with an expression that was not pity and not admiration and not disbelief, but something harder to name, the look of a woman who recognized a gamble because she had made one herself once and did not yet know if this one deserved respect or grief. I will bring you linseed oil tomorrow, Marta said, for the joints. That is not help. That is a loan. You will pay me back in spring. She left. Ragna watched her go, then dropped back into the trench and kept digging. Word traveled. On a homestead prairie, word always traveled, because there was nothing else to carry across the empty miles except weather and gossip. By the end of the first week, the settlement knew that the Solheim girl was digging a trench, not a root cellar, not a well, not a privy, a trench 50 feet long aimed at her cabin wall, and she claimed she was going to bury pipe in it and feed air to her stove through the ground. Silas Voss heard about it on a Wednesday. Voss owned the freight yard and the woodlot, which in a settlement that burned wood to survive made him as close to powerful as the prairie allowed. He was 46, American-born, originally from Ohio, and he had come to Dakota not to homestead, but to sell to homesteaders. He bought distressed claims for half their filing cost. He sold lumber at prices that made men wince and pay. He extended credit that lasted exactly as long as a family's desperation, and he collected in land when they could not pay in cash. Ragna's claim sat on good grass with water access. Voss had offered to buy it the day after Halvor's funeral. Ragna had said no. Voss did not appreciate being told no by a 16-year-old girl, and he appreciated it less when the reason was not stubbornness, but the specific insult of a girl who thought she knew something grown men did not. He found Ragna at the Mercantile on Saturday, where she had come to ask about lime. She needed lime for joint sealant. Marta's linseed oil would help, but the pipe joints needed something with calciumite to harden properly in wet clay. Voss was on the porch when she came out. 3 men sat with him, including a farmer named Garrett, who bought his firewood from Voss on credit. I hear you are building something out there, Voss said. His voice carried the porch-wide ease of a man who owned the chairs. I am, Ragna said. A buried pipe, they tell me. Air from underground to your stove. Yes. Voss leaned back. He looked at Garrett and the other men. The orphan girl says the cold comes from the stove, he said. She says the fire is freezing the room. Next thing she'll tell us to bury the chimney underground. The men laughed. Ragna felt it, the sound moving through her, the way cold moved through the cabin walls. It was not cruel laughter. It was the easy, reflexive laughter of people who believed they already understood the subject and found the contradiction amusing. Good, Voss continued. Let her bury the winter and see if dirt burns. When the drift covers that trench, remember I offered to buy the claim at a fair price. Ragna stood on the porch steps with a sack of lime she had bought with 3 of her $16. She had $13 left. She had 25 feet of trench dug. She had no pipe sections formed yet. She had no kiln. She had no mentor. She had a theory that lived in her father's memory and a feeling in her ankles, and every person in the settlement except Marta Bell thought she was foolish, grieving, or both. She walked home in the dark, 3 miles on a rutted track, with the lime on her back and the laughter in her ears. That night she did not light the stove until she had held a burning twist of hay near every crack she could reach. She counted the leaks again. 11 had become 13. The felt was pulling away from the northeast corner where wind shear worked the nails loose. The stove would eat more air through that gap than through any other, and the floor on that side would be colder than the rest by morning. She lit the stove. She fed it carefully, a quarter split at a time, because every piece of wood she burned now was a piece she would not have in January. The pipe glowed. The upper cabin warmed. The floor stayed cold. $13. 1.5 cords. 25 feet of trench. 0 pipe sections. And winter was no longer approaching. Winter was here. The question was only how deep it intended to go. She lay down. She pulled both blankets up. She felt the floor draft cross her shins like a blade. Tomorrow she would start forming pipe. She had clay. She had a method in her mind, coil-built cylinders 5 inches across, dried near the stove, fired in a pit with whatever fuel she could spare. She had never done it before. She had watched her father shape wood and understood that shaping anything required patience, measurement, and the willingness to destroy what you built if it was not right. But she had no one to show her how clay behaved when it dried. She did not know what temperature would harden it without shattering it. She did not know how to build a firing pit, or how long the sections needed, or what would happen if she got the walls too thin or the bore too narrow. She needed someone who knew fire and clay and how heat moved through material. She needed someone, and there was no one. Outside, the wind leaned against the northeast wall, and the felt breathed inward, and the floor draft quickened, and the stove ate its stolen air, and the temperature read 9 degrees above 0 on the thermometer her father had nailed beside the canvas door. November was 12 days old. The blizzard would come in January. She had 60 days. She had an empty trench and a head full of theory and $13 in hands that already ached from the spade. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. But when she opened them before dawn, she got up and she started again. Ansel Bjerke arrived on the 14th of November, not because anyone sent him and not because he had heard about the trench. He arrived because he was walking south from a brickyard near Aberdeen that had closed when the owner died, and the De Smet settlement was on the road to Huron, where he hoped to find winter work before his money ran out. He was 54 years old, Danish-born, with a knee that had been ruined 12 years earlier when a kiln wall collapsed during a firing and pinned his right leg under 400 pounds of hot brick. The knee had healed wrong. It locked in cold weather and buckled on uneven ground, and it had cost him every permanent position he had held since the accident. He walked with a staff cut from ash, and he carried his tools in a canvas roll on his back, a wire bow, a forming paddle, a joint knife, a set of smoothing stones, and a small fireman's level he had owned since his apprenticeship in Odense. He came past Ragna's claim because the road bent that way. He saw the trench. He stopped. The trench was 32 feet long by then. Ragna had dug it in 11 days of labor that had split the skin on both her palms and put a permanent ache in the muscles along her spine. The walls were uneven. The depth varied between 4 and 6 feet, depending on where clay gave way and where stone forced detours. The spoil pile ran along the windward side, the way her father would have placed it, though she did not know that was correct. She had done it because it seemed sensible to block the wind from filling the open cut with drift. Ansel stood at the edge and looked down for a long time. Ragna was at the far end waist-deep, chipping at a seam of hard clay with her spade. She did not notice him until his shadow crossed the trench wall. She looked up. A man she had never seen, leaning on a stick, studying her work with an expression she could not read. "You are not guessing," Ansel said. "You are measuring." Ragna climbed out. She was mud-caked to her elbows, her hair tied with a strip of sacking, her coat streaked with clay. She was also holding the spade like a weapon because a girl alone on the prairie learned to hold tools that way when strangers appeared. "Who are you?" she asked. "A man who has laid more pipe than you have seen," Ansel said. He pointed at the trench with his staff. "That is for air, not water. The grade falls toward the cabin. You want something to flow downhill by draft, not by gravity." Ragna felt something shift behind her ribs. Not hope. She did not trust hope, but recognition. The same feeling she had when her father looked at a joint and saw the flaw before she could name it. "How do you know what it is for?" she asked. "Because if it were for water, you would have started at the source, not at the house. And because the angle is wrong for drainage, but correct for draw." He lowered himself to one knee, the good knee, and reached into the trench to press his thumb against the wall. He rubbed the clay between his fingers. "This will fire. It is dense enough, but you will need to temper it with sand, or the sections will crack in the kiln." "I do not have a kiln," Ragna said. "You have a pit and fuel, and someone who knows what temperature turns clay to pipe." He looked at her. "If you want the help." "Why would you help me?" Ansel considered the question. He looked at the trench again, 32 feet of hand labor, straight-walled, graded correctly by instinct or intelligence, with spoil placed to block the prevailing wind. He looked at the cabin with its tarred felt and its cracked stove and its canvas door. "Because you are doing something I have not seen before," he said, "and because you are doing it correctly enough that a poor joint will ruin it, and I cannot walk past a thing that is almost right." He stayed. Not in the cabin. That would have ended her reputation entirely in a settlement already suspicious of her judgment. He made a lean-to against the south wall of the claimed small shed using scrap lumber and a section of canvas Ragna had stored for patching the roof. He slept there with his tools beside him and his coat over his legs, and in exchange for labor, he asked only for food and the right to fire test pieces in whatever kiln they built. The first thing he taught her was how to form pipe. They dug clay from the well pit and the trench spoil. Ansel showed her how to wedge it, cutting, stacking, and compressing until the air pockets were driven out and the material was smooth enough to hold shape. He taught her to roll coils the thickness of her thumb and build them in spirals around a wooden form he carved from a fence post, 5 inches interior diameter, walls 3/4 of an inch thick, each section 18 inches long, with a flared female end and a tapered male end so they would seat together without slipping. "Too thin, and the frost will split them underground," Ansel said. He held up a section she had formed that morning. "Too thick, and you waste clay and add weight you cannot carry." He pressed his thumbnail into the wall. 3/4 of an inch. Feel the difference between that and 1/2 an inch. Learn it in your hands because your hands will form 100 of these before you are finished. She learned. Her first 6 sections cracked during drying, too fast, too close to the stove. Ansel showed her to dry them slowly in the shed, turning them a quarter rotation each day, covering them with damp cloth when the surface dried faster than the core. Her 7th section held. Her 8th was better. By the 20th, she could form a section in 40 minutes and know by the sound it made when she tapped it whether the walls were even. The second thing he taught her was firing. They built a pit kiln east of the shed, below the wind line, using stones from the creek bed and clay from the trench, spoil for lining. Ansel was precise about temperature in the way that Torvik was precise about winters, not in numbers, but in the language of color and behavior. When the clay glows red at the edges, you are close. When the glow moves to the center and the surface looks wet even though it is dry, you're there. Hold it for the count of 400. If you rush, the center stays soft and the frost will find it. Each firing used fuel. That was the cruelest arithmetic. Every stick that went into the kiln was a stick that did not go into the stove. Ragna calculated. Each firing hardened 4 sections. She needed roughly 33 sections for 50 feet of run. That meant 8 or 9 firings. Each firing consumed a quarter quart of fuel if she included the drying heat in the kiln charge. 2 quarts of fuel for the pipe alone. From a supply she measured at a quart and a half, with winter already pressing at the walls. "You're spending your heat to make a thing that is supposed to save heat," Marta said when she came with bread and saw the kiln smoke. "Do you see the problem?" "I see it," Ragna said. "But if the pipe works, I will burn half the wood through the winter that I would without it. If it does not work, I was dead already. The fuel cost is the same either way." Marta did not argue. She left the bread and a jar of boiled linseed she had rendered from seed stored since autumn. "For the joints," she said. "This is still alone." The third thing Ansel taught her was sealing. This was the work that would determine whether the system held or leaked. Every joint, 32 of them, had to be airtight underground where no one could reach them once the trench was backfilled. Ansel mixed a sealant from clay slip, fine sand, wood ash, and the lime Ragna had bought from the mercantile. He added linseed oil to the mixture and worked it to the consistency of bread dough. "You seat the male end into the female," he said, demonstrating with 2 finished sections on the ground beside the trench. "Press until the shoulder stops. Then you pack this around the joint, thumb width thick, all the way around, then you wrap." He cut a strip of cloth, soaked it in a mixture of linseed and pine pitch he had heated over the kiln coals, and wound it twice around the joint over the sealant. Then you pack clay over the cloth. 3 layers: sealant, wrap, clay. The sealant seals. The wrap holds the sealant. The clay protects the wrap from shifting when you backfill. "How do you know this?" Ragna asked. "Because I laid sewer pipe in Yankton for 2 winters and watched what happened when the joints were done wrong." He pressed the sealed joint and nodded. "Wrong joints shift. Shifted joints leak. Leaks in a sewer mean smell. Leaks in your line mean cold air shortcuts, and your whole 50 feet becomes 10 feet of tempering and 40 feet of frozen nothing." Ragna practiced the seal until she could do it by feel in dim light. Ansel watched without correcting for the last 3 joints she sealed. That was how she knew she had it. November ended. December came like a door closing. The temperature dropped into single digits for 3 consecutive days during the first week, and Ragna burned through a quarter cord, keeping the stove alive while she continued to form, fire, and lay pipe. Progress by December 5th. 41 feet of trench dug, 26 sections fired and hardened, 20 laid and sealed in the trench, 6 feet of trench backfilled over completed sections. What remained? 9 feet of trench, 7 more sections to fire, the intake hood to fabricate, the stove connection to build, and the full backfill. What she had left in fuel, roughly 1 cord. Enough for perhaps 6 weeks of careful burning without the pipe system working, or enough for the rest of winter if the system cut her consumption the way she believed it would. 13 days of firing remained. Each day she lost fuel. Each day the ground hardened further. Torvik reappeared on December 8th. He had been freighting east and returned through the settlement. He came to Ragna's claim, saw the trench now nearly complete, saw the kiln, saw Ansel working beside her, and stood at the edge of the open cut, looking at 20 feet of sealed pipe visible before the backfill started. He crouched and put his hand near a joint. He pressed it. It held. "You have been busy," Torvik said. His voice carried no mockery. It carried something worse. The careful neutrality of a man who still believed she would fail, but could not say exactly why anymore. "Will it work?" Ragna asked. I have lived 61 winters, Torvik said. I've never seen air come out of the ground warm enough to matter, but I have also never seen anyone try. He stood, his knees cracked. Your fuel is short. You know that. I know that. And your walls are still thin. The northeast felt is pulling away. I know that too. He looked at Ansel. You are the brickman from Aberdeen. I am, Ansel said. Can you tell her this will work? Ansel leaned on his staff. His bad knee was swollen from the cold, and he shifted his weight with the careful deliberation of a man who planned each step. I can tell her the pipe is good. I can tell her the joints are sealed better than most sewer work I have seen. I can tell her the grade is right, and the depth is deep enough to be below frost in a normal winter. He paused. I cannot tell her what a Dakota blizzard will do to an idea no one has tested. Neither can you. Torvik nodded. He left without offering advice or money. His silence was louder than Voss's laughter had been. December 15th, the last section was fired. Ragna pulled it from the kiln at dawn and tested it with a tap of Ansel's forming paddle. The ring was clean, not the dull thud of underfired clay or the tinny crack of overfired. A clear, round note that Ansel said meant the walls were true all the way through. They laid the final sections that afternoon. The trench was now a continuous line of sealed clay pipe running 51 feet from a point 6 feet east of the cabin's north wall to an intake position she'd chosen on higher ground, above the expected drift line, sheltered from the prevailing northwest wind by a small rise in the terrain. The intake hood was the last fabrication. Ansel fashioned it from scrap tin, a section of stovepipe Ragna had traded her cracked sled runner for at the mercantile, bent into an inverted elbow with a wire screen across the mouth to keep snow and debris out. He set it on a stone base above the buried pipe's open end, angled away from the wind, with a removable cap Rana could clear if drifting threatened to bury it. The stove connection was the most delicate work. Ansel cut a hole in the lower panel of the stove's ash box door and fitted a clay collar he had formed specifically for the opening. The collar accepted the final pipe section's male end. He sealed the junction with his 3-layer method and added a damper, a flat piece of tin on a wire pivot, so Ragna could control or shut the underground air supply. Open damper. The stove breathes from the ground, Ansel said. Closed damper. The stove breathes from the room like every other stove in Dakota. Leave it open unless the intake freezes or you need to inspect the box. They backfilled the remaining trench by torchlight. The ground was frozen harder now, and the spoil had turned to chunks that had to be broken with the back of the spade before they would pack around the pipe. Ragna's hands bled through her wrappings. Ansel could not kneel, so he worked standing, pushing spoil into the cut with his good foot and his staff. It was midnight when they finished. The trench was gone. 51 feet of clay pipe lay buried under 6 feet of Dakota earth, sealed at every joint, graded at a gentle fall toward the cabin, open at both ends. Ragna stood at the intake and held a lit twist of hay over the hood. The flame bent. Not much. The stove was cold, the draft minimal. But the flame bent, pulled toward the mouth of the hood, following the air that was already beginning to move through the buried line toward the low pressure zone the stove would create. Light the stove, Ansel said. She went inside. She built a fire. Small at first, shavings and kindling, then a quarter split, then a half. The stove drew. The pipe warmed. She opened the damper on the ash box collar. She heard it. A low, steady breath. Not wind. The wind was outside. This was the sound of air being pulled through 50 feet of buried clay, tempered by the earth, arriving at the stove's draft box. At something other than the 21 degrees below zero, the thermometer read outside the canvas door. She held her hand over the collar. The air entering the stove was cold, but it was not killing cold. It was the cold of the well pit, the cold of soil that remembered autumn. She knelt by the floor. The draft, the knife-edge river that had cut across her shins every night since October, was quieter, not gone. The cabin still leaked at 13 points, but the stove was no longer sucking its air through those leaks with the same desperate pull. It had another source now, a better source, and the floor, for the first time since her father died, felt like a floor and not like a creek bed in December. Ansel stood in the doorway with his bad knee locked straight and his staff braced against the frame. He watched Ragna kneeling by the stove with her hand near the floor, tears running down her face, not from grief, but from something she could not name. "It is not proof yet," he said. "This is a mild night. Proof comes when the wind does." She nodded. She wiped her face. She fed the stove another split and listened to the breath in the clay pipe and waited for the wind to come and tell her if she had built something that mattered or only something that worked when it did not have to. January arrived the way January arrives on the Great Plains, not with a single blow, but with a slow compression, as though the sky were lowering itself onto the ground an inch at a time. Temperatures fell to 10 below on the 4th, 15 below on the 7th. The snow that came was thin and hard, more like airborne sand than flake, and it packed into every crevice and seam on the claim. Ragna's system ran constantly. She kept the damper open, the stove fed at a steady, moderate level, and the intake clear. Each morning she walked to the hood and swept snow from the screen with a broom made of bound grass. The pipe had not frozen. The joints had not leaked. The air arriving at the stove box was measurably different from the air outside. She could not give a number, but she could give a sensation. The floor remained bearable, not warm. Bearable. Children could sit on it without crying. She tested with her father's methods. A pail of water near the floor took longer to skim ice than it had before. Bread dough set near the stove bench rose faster than it had in November. A candle flame held at ankle height bent only slightly toward the wall seams, where before it had dragged sideways hard enough to gutter. Marta came and stood inside the cabin for 10 minutes without speaking. She put her hand on the floor. She put her hand near the stove collar. She looked at Ragna with the expression of someone revising a calculation they had thought was finished. "It is warmer down low," Marta said. "I would not have believed it." "Tell Torvik," Ragna said. "Torvik believes what a blizzard tells him. So do I." But she stayed for dinner. That was something. January 12th, 1888, began with a lie. The morning was warm, not spring warm, prairie warm, which in January meant the air did not hurt. Snow softened on the eaves of every cabin in the settlement. Water dripped. Children went out without mittens. Men stood in shirt sleeves on the mercantile porch and said things like, "Maybe the worst is past and we might see an early thaw." Ragna felt the warmth and did not trust it. She had no reason for the distrust except that the warmth felt wrong, too sudden, too soft, too much like a door opening before a door slammed shut. She checked the intake hood. She swept the screen even though it did not need sweeping. She brought the goat into the shed and latched the door. She hauled an extra armload of fuel inside and stacked it beside the stove. Ansel watched her from the lean-to where he sat mending a boot. "You are preparing," he said. "The air smells different," Ragna said. She could not explain it better than that. The air smelled like iron and dust, the way it sometimes did before a summer storm in Minnesota, but sharper. By noon the sky to the northwest had changed color. Not darkened, changed. It became a shade that was not gray and not blue and not white, but something that had no name in any language Ragna spoke, a color that looked like the sky was bruising. By 1 o'clock, the wind arrived. It did not build, it hit. One moment, the air was still and warm enough for open coats. The next moment, the air was a white wall moving across the prairie faster than a horse could run, and the temperature was falling so fast that the moisture on the cabin's tarred felt froze in streaks before Ragna could get the canvas door tied shut. The thermometer read 34 degrees above zero at noon. By 3 o'clock, the mercury had dropped past zero. By 5 o'clock, it had fallen below the lowest mark on the scale, somewhere past 20 below, and the wind was driving snow horizontally at a velocity that turned flakes into projectiles that stung like thrown gravel. The temperature dropped more than 50 degrees in 5 hours. Ragna felt every degree of it. The cabin walls sang, a high, thin vibration she had never heard before, the sound of tarred felt and rough planking flexing under wind pressure that pushed the walls inward. Snow forced through the seams she had chinked with moss and clay in November. White lines appeared along the northeast wall where the felt was weakest, as though the blizzard were drawing a map of every flaw in the building. She opened the stove damper wide. The fire caught and pulled hard, and for the first time she heard the difference clearly. The breath through the buried pipe changed pitch, deeper, steadier, as the stove's demand for air increased against the storm. The pipe delivered. Air from 6 feet underground, tempered by earth that did not know what was happening on the surface, flowed into the stove box while the wind outside tried to kill everything it could reach. The floor held. The seams leaked cold. They would always leak cold. But the stove was not pulling that cold anymore. It was drinking from the pipe. And because it was drinking from the pipe, the floor did not become the river of killing air it would have been in any other cabin in the settlement. Ansel came in from the lean-to 15 minutes after the wind struck. His lean-to had held for 60 seconds. He limped through the door with his tool roll on his back and his knee locked rigid, snow caked in his beard, his face the color of ash. Ragna got him onto the bench beside the stove and wrapped his knee in wool soaked with warm water. The intake, Ansel said through clenched teeth. If the drift covers it, the system dies. Go now while you can still find it. Ragna pulled her coat tight, tied a rope to the stove leg, and went out the door into the blizzard. She could not see. The world was white noise, white air, white ground, white sky, all of it moving. She followed the rope to its end, then dropped to her knees and crawled northwest toward where she knew the intake stood. The snow hit her face like flung sand. She breathed through her collar and tasted wool and ice. She found the hood by feel. Snow had already packed against the base, and the screen was half blocked with driven ice crystals. She cleared it with her bare hands because her mittens were too thick for the wire mesh. The cold hit her fingers like a hammer. She felt the skin on her knuckles split. She extended the hood with a barrel ring she had wired to the base for exactly this purpose, raising the intake mouth another 8 inches above the drift line. She packed snow around the base to stabilize it. She cleared the screen a second time. Then she crawled back along the rope, hand over hand, and fell through the door onto the cabin floor. Her hands were white. Ansel pulled her to the stove and held her fingers near the iron until the color came back, and the color came back with pain that made her cry out for the first time since her father's funeral. The intake held. The pipe breathed. At 7 o'clock, Marta Bell struck the cabin door with both fists. Ragna opened it, and the wind nearly tore the canvas from its nails. Marta fell inside carrying Nels on her hip. The boy was 7 years old, and he was not moving. His face was gray. His eyes were open, but they did not track. His hands hung at his sides like objects that no longer belonged to him. He went to the shed for the milk pail, Marta said. Her voice was flat with the particular calm of a woman who had moved past panic into the place beyond it where the body simply performs the next task. The wind took him off the path. I found him against the fence post. He was there maybe 15 minutes. Ragnar looked at Nels. His lips were blue. His breathing was shallow and fast, the panting rhythm of a body trying to warm itself from inside when the outside had stopped cooperating. "Get his coat off," Ragnar said. "His boots, everything wet. Ansel, the stones." Ansel had already placed 2 flat stones against the stove. He wrapped them in cloth and slid them toward the floor, where Marta was stripping Nels's wet layers with hands that shook badly enough to fumble the buttons. They wrapped the boy in both blankets, with the warm stones against his feet and his chest. They lifted him onto the bench beside the stove, above the floor, where the air was warmest. Ragna added fuel, a full split, then another, burning through her reserves without hesitation, because reserves meant nothing if a child died on her floor. Nels did not respond. For 20 minutes, he lay wrapped and still, breathing too fast, his skin the color of uncooked dough. Marta held his hand and spoke to him in a low voice that was not quite words. Ragna watched his face and counted his breaths and felt the floor under her knees and noticed, with a clarity that cut through every other thought, that the floor was not freezing her. The stove was burning hard, and the pipe was feeding it earth-tempered air, and the cabin was holding at the level of the living, the level where bodies could function, the level that every other cabin in the settlement was losing. At 23 minutes, Nels shuddered. Not a small tremor, a full-body convulsion that arched his back and made Marta gasp. Then another, then a third, weaker, that settled into a steady shivering, and the shivering was the most beautiful sound in the room because shivering meant his body was fighting again instead of surrendering. "More heat," Ansel said from the bench. His voice was rough. "Keep the stones rotating, and do not let him sleep yet. If the core is still dropping, sleep will take him deeper." Ragna heated the stones again. Marta rubbed the boy's feet with wool until the gray faded to pink, then to red. And Nels made a sound that was not a word, but was close enough to language that Marta pressed her face against his chest and did not move for a long time. Outside, the settlement was failing. Ragna could not see it, but she could hear it in the voices that came later. Garrett, the farmer who bought wood from Voss on credit, had a cabin with squared logs and good chinking, but a stove that sucked air through the floor seams the way every stove did. He fed it until the pipe glowed cherry red, and the upper room was hot enough to loosen the pitch between the logs. The floor stayed frozen. His wife put their 2 children on the table, because the table was the highest surface in the room, and the children slept on the table with their coats on, while the stove consumed fuel at a rate that would empty their wood stack by morning. Old Henriksen, who had told everyone at the mercantile that he had enough coal for 2 winters, was found the next day sitting upright in his chair with his hands in his lap and his stove still hot. The coal had kept the upper air warm. The floor had killed him. He had frozen from the feet up, conscious probably, unable to stand because his legs had stopped working before his heart did. A family named Strand, 3 miles west, stuffed every crack with quilts and blankets to stop the drafts. They succeeded. They also sealed the cabin so tightly that the stove could not draw enough air, and the fire smoldered and filled the room with smoke. They opened the door to breathe, and the blizzard entered like something alive. They spent the night huddled in the corner farthest from the door with wet cloth over their faces, choosing between smoke and cold, winning against neither. In Ragna's cabin, the stove breathed from the pipe. The floor held. The walls leaked. They would always leak. But the leak was passive now, not driven by the stove's hunger. The air that entered through the seams was cold, but it was not a river. It was a seep, and a seep could be managed. A seep could be pushed back by a fire that was not wasting half its output, replacing the air it had already consumed. By midnight, the cabin held 4 people: Ragna, Ansel, Marta, and Nels. Nels was sleeping now, true sleep, color returning, breathing steady. Marta sat beside him with her back against the wall and her eyes open, watching the stove as though it were a person she was learning to trust. Ansel sat on the bench with his bad knee propped straight and his hands folded over his staff. He had not spoken in 2 hours. Ragna looked at him and saw what the blizzard and the knee and the work had cost. He was gray beneath the weathering, and his breathing had a catch in it that had not been there in November. Ragna checked the stove. Half a cord remained in the cabin. In a normal winter night, at normal burn rate, without the pipe, she would have gone through a third of a cord by now. She had burned less than a quarter. The difference was the buried line doing exactly what she had built it to do, carrying earth-tempered air to the stove so the fire could heat the room instead of fighting its own appetite. She went out once more at 2 a.m. to clear the intake. The drift had climbed, but the barrel ring extension held the mouth above the snow line. She cleared the screen, checked the wire, and crawled back. Her hands had barely healed from the first trip, and the second opened the splits again. She wrapped them in strips of flour sacking and held them near the stove and did not think about pain because pain was a luxury for people who had time. The blizzard screamed until dawn. It screamed the way the prairie screamed when it wanted something dead, not with malice, but with indifference, which was worse. Wind speeds that turned snow into something closer to sandblasting. Temperatures that turned exposed skin into something closer to wood. A darkness so complete that the world outside the cabin did not exist except as sound and pressure and the knowledge that it was trying to get in. At 5 a.m, the wind eased, not stopped, eased. The difference between a roar and a moan. Ragna opened the canvas door an inch and saw gray light and snow still falling, but falling now instead of flying. The thermometer had burst sometime in the night. The mercury had contracted below the bulb and cracked the glass. She did not need it. She knew what the temperature was. It was the temperature at which people died, and she had not died, and the boy on the bench had not died, and the stove was still burning, and the pipe was still breathing, and the floor of her 12 by 14 cabin was still a place where a human body could exist. She sat on the floor with her back against the stove and her ruined hands in her lap, and she listened to the pipe breathe, and she waited for morning. Morning came gray and still. The wind had dropped to something a body could stand in, and the snow had stopped falling, and the prairie lay under a white so complete it erased every mark that human labor had ever put on it. Fences vanished. Paths vanished. The track between claims became a guess. Ragna opened the canvas door and saw drift packed halfway to the lintel, and above the drift a sky the color of tin and smoke rising from 3 chimneys in the settlement when there should have been 9. She dug out the door with her father's spade. The snow was dense and heavy, packed by wind into something closer to plaster than powder, and each shovelful weighed enough to make her shoulders burn. She cleared a path to the intake hood first. The barrel ring extension stood 6 inches above the drift. The screen was crusted with ice, but not blocked. She cleaned it, checked the wire, and felt the faint pull of air still moving through the buried line into the stove box. The system had held. Through the worst night the prairie had thrown at it, the pipe had breathed, the joints had sealed, and the stove had burned a third less fuel than any calculation said it should have. She went back inside. Nels was awake, sitting up on the bench with a blanket around his shoulders and a cup of warm water in his hands. His color was good. His fingers moved. Marta sat beside him with her arm across his back, and when she looked at Ragna, her expression had changed from the flat calm of the night before into something raw and harder to contain. His toes, Marta said. They are pink. I checked. All 10. Ansel had not moved from the bench. His knee had swollen to the size of a melon overnight, and his face had the waxy sheen of a man running a fever he would not admit to. But he was conscious, and when Ragna knelt to check the stove collar, he said, "Check the damper pivot. The expansion may have warped the tin." She checked. The pivot was stiff but functional. The damper opened and closed. The pipe was intact. "You built well," Ansel said. It was the first time he had said it without a qualification. Torvik came at midday. He arrived on foot because his horse had broken through a drift and refused to go further. He had walked 2 miles from the settlement in snow to his thighs, and when he reached Ragna's door, he was breathing hard, and his beard was white with frozen moisture, and his hands were shaking inside his gloves. Ragna let him in. He stood in the center of the cabin the way he had stood in October, turning a slow circle. But this time he was not assessing the building. He was assessing what the building had done. He crouched slowly, because his own knees were 61 years old, and the walk had punished them, and held his bare hand flat against the floor. He held it there for 10 seconds the way he had in October. Then he moved it to the wall, near a seam. Then he moved it to the stove collar, where the pipe connection fed tempered air into the draft box. He stood up. "Your floor is warmer than Garrett's table," Torvik said. "Garrett's children slept on the table last night because the floor was killing them. Henriksen is dead. The strands nearly suffocated." "I know," Ragna said. "Your father said something to me once, when we were unloading a freight run in Huron. He said a house should work with a fire, not against it. I thought he was talking about chimney draw. He was talking about this." Torvik reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch and set it on the stovetop the way he had set 2 silver dollars there in October. "That is $12, he said. "It is not charity. It is payment. I want you to show me what you buried, and I want you to tell me how it works. Not because I believe it yet, because Henriksen is dead, and he had more coal than any man in the settlement, and that means coal was not the problem." Ragna took the pouch. She did not open it. She looked at Torvik, at his wind-burned face and his frost-cracked lips, and his eyes that had seen a dead man sitting upright in a warm room with frozen feet. And she said, "I will show you, but I need to show you something else first." She took a twist of hay, lit it from the stove, and held it low along the floor near the northeast wall seam. The flame bent slightly inward, barely, a fraction of the pull it had shown before the pipe was installed. "Watch," she said. She closed the damper on the stove collar. The pipe supply cut off. The stove's draft shifted instantly to the room. The flame at the floor seam dragged hard sideways, guttering, pulled toward the stove with enough force to make the lit hay smoke and spit. She opened the damper again. The flame calmed. "That is what your stove does in every cabin in this settlement," Ragna said. "It eats air from outside through every leak in the walls, and that air comes in at whatever the temperature is outside, 20 below, 30 below. It slides across the floor where your body is, and the stove cannot overcome it because the stove is causing it." Torvik watched the flame. He watched it twice more as Rana opened and closed the damper. His face did not change expression, but his hands, which had been clasped behind his back, dropped to his sides. "I told you to cut more wood," Torvik said. His voice was quiet. "I told you the problem was fuel." "The problem was air," Ragna said. "The fuel was a symptom." Torvik nodded. He did not apologize. He was not a man who apologized. But he nodded, and he stayed for an hour, and he asked questions, specific questions about depth and pipe diameter and joint sealing and intake placement, and he wrote the answers on the back of a freight receipt with a pencil stub he kept in his vest. When he left, he said, "I will send Garrett tomorrow. and the strand boy. They will want to see. Send them, Ragna said. They came. Not just Garrett and the strand boy, but 6 others in the first week, and 4 more in the second. They came because Henriksen was dead, and because their children had slept on tables, and because a 16-year-old girl's cabin had held when theirs had not, and the reason was not luck or better wood or thicker walls, but a buried clay pipe that none of them had understood or believed in. Ragna showed each one the same demonstration. The lit scrap near the floor, the damper opened and closed, the difference visible in the behavior of a flame. She did not lecture. She showed, and she let them feel the floor with their own hands, and she answered questions with the patience of someone who had heard every possible objection from Marta Bell first, and had survived each one. Marta herself became the first student. She arrived the day after Torvik with a notebook she had made from folded brown paper and a charcoal stick, and she sat on the floor of Ragna's cabin and drew diagrams while Ragna talked. She asked about depth. She asked about pipe diameter. She asked about joint sealant composition and intake placement and damper construction. She asked every question she had asked in October, but this time the questions were not objections. They were plans. My cabin leaks worse than yours, Marta said. The south wall has a gap at the sill I've been stuffing with rags since last winter. Then your stove is pulling harder through that gap than mine ever did, Ragna said. A pipe run will matter more for you than it did for me. I cannot dig a trench alone, not with Nels to mind. You will not dig alone. Marta looked up from her paper. Who will help? Torvik is sending men. They want to learn. They can learn on your cabin first. It was the right decision. Teaching on Marta's claim meant Ragna could supervise without digging, which her hands needed. The splits had not healed, and 2 of her fingernails were blackened from the cold damage during the intake clearing. It also meant the first copy of her system would be built under her direct instruction, joint by joint, with someone watching every seal. Voss heard about the visitors. He heard about Torvik's $12. He heard about Garrett asking Ragna for advice instead of buying more wood from the freight yard. The information reached him the way all information reaches a man whose business depends on fear, as a threat. He said nothing publicly for 2 weeks. He watched. He calculated. And when 5 households had visited Ragna's claim and 2 had begun digging test trenches, Voss walked into the mercantile and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Clever trick for a warm winter. Let us see what happens in a real one." Nobody laughed. That was the first sign that the ground had shifted. February settled into the rhythm that follows crisis, shorter days, colder nights, the steady work of survival stripped of its desperation and replaced with something closer to endurance. Ragna's fuel lasted. Her system ran. She burned through her remaining cord at a rate that would see her to March with margin, which was a word she had not been able to use about any resource since her father's death. Ansel stayed through February, though staying cost him. His knee did not improve. The swelling receded, but the joint itself had stiffened further, and on cold mornings he could not straighten the leg at all without bracing his hands on his thigh and forcing it. He moved from the lean-to, which Ragna rebuilt after the blizzard destroyed it, into the shed, where she installed a small clay pipe run from the cabin system to give him tempered air through a secondary branch. The branch was his idea. If the principle works for one stove, it works for any enclosed space with a heat source, he said. Run a spur off the main line. Smaller pipe. Shorter run. The shed has a brazier. Feed it. They built the branch together. It was the first improvement to the original system, and it taught Ragna something Ansel had been waiting for her to discover, that the buried line was not a single tool, but a principle that could be extended, branched, and adapted. The pipe was not the innovation. The innovation was understanding where air came from and choosing to change the answer. Ansel told her about the kiln collapse in Odense on a night in late February, when the wind was steady but not violent, and the stove burned low, and the cabin smelled like clay and smoke and the linseed they used for joint work. "I was 22, he said. The kiln was a bottle type, 12 feet tall, and we had loaded it with 600 bricks for a church foundation in Roskill. The firemen, that was my job, tending the fire, miscalculated the draft. The updraft hit the crown too hard. The crown cracked. The wall followed. I was on the loading side." He showed her the knee. Not the swelling, but the old scars, white and ridged, running from mid-thigh to shin, where the skin had been burned and then crushed, and then burned again as the hot bricks settled. "They told me I would not walk," Ansel said. "I walked. They told me I would not work a kiln again. I worked kilns for 30 more years. They were right about one thing. I would never run from a collapse again. The knee does not allow it." Ragna did not know what to say. She had learned by now that Ansel did not want sympathy. He wanted to be seen accurately, the way he saw a joint or a grade or a clay body, without sentiment, with precision. "Is that why you stopped to look at my trench?" she asked. "I stopped because the trench was correct," Ansel said. "I stayed because you were working alone, and I know what that costs." It was the closest he came to tenderness. Ragna held it the way she held the warmth from the stove, carefully, knowing it would not last. They clashed in March over the intake design. Ragna wanted to build a permanent stone housing around the intake hood, a low cairn with a ventilated cap that would shed snow, resist wind, and protect the screen from debris. Ansel wanted to keep it simple: replaceable tin hood, wire screen, barrel ring extension for drift conditions. Nothing permanent, nothing that could not be removed and repaired in minutes. "Stone is better," Ragna said. "Stone does not rust. Stone does not blow off." "Stone cannot be moved," Ansel said. "When the intake clogs, and it will clog every winter because snow does not care about stone, you need to reach the pipe mouth in seconds, not chisel through a cairn." "I can build a cairn with an access gap." "And the gap will fill with drift, and you will be back to clearing with bare hands in a blizzard, except now you are clearing stone as well as snow." The argument lasted 2 days. They did not shout. They disagreed the way craftspeople disagree, with drawings in the dirt, with demonstrations, with the stubborn specificity of people who care more about the work than about being right. Ansel won. Not because his argument was stronger, but because Ragna tested both designs and found that the stone cairn added 30 minutes to clearing time in a simulated drift, and 30 minutes in a blizzard was the difference between a cleared intake and a dead fire. "You are better at the work than I was at your age," Ansel said, "but you build for the version of winter you survived. I build for the version that has not come yet." She remembered that. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Spring came in late March with a violence that matched the winter, ice breaking on the creek with a sound like gunfire, mud so deep the track became impassable for 2 weeks, meltwater pooling around every cabin foundation, and testing every seal that cold had not already tested. Ragna inspected her buried line during the thaw. She dug test windows at 3 points along the trench and found the joints intact, the seal in holding, and the pipe uncracked. Water had seeped along the outside of the pipe in some sections, but had not penetrated the joints. The 3-layer seal, sealant, pitch-soaked wrap, clay pack, had done what Ansel designed it to do. "Good pipe," Ansel said, inspecting the test window nearest the cabin. He pressed his thumb against a joint the way he had pressed it against the first practice joint in November. "Good seal. This will last 10 years if you keep the intake clean and the damper pivot oiled." He left in April. His knee required a surgeon, he said, and the nearest was in Sioux Falls. He packed his tool roll, tied it on his back, and stood in the doorway of Ragnar's cabin for a moment that was longer than necessary. "You do not need me for the next one," he said. "You know the pipe. You know the seal. You know the grade. What you do not know yet, you will learn by failing, and failure will teach you faster than I did." He left her his molds, the wooden forms for pipe sections, hand-carved and worn smooth by years of use. He left the fireman's level. He did not leave instructions for either because she did not need them. "Invisible work saves more lives than proud work," he said. It was the last thing he told her before he walked south on the track toward Huron with his staff in his right hand and his bad knee making every step a negotiation. Ragnar watched him until the road bent and the prairie took him. She stood in the doorway and felt the spring air on her face and the ache in her hands where the blizzard scars were still pink. And she did not cry because crying was a luxury and because Ansel would not have wanted it. He would have wanted her to check the intake and oil the damper pivot and plan the next installation. She checked the intake. She oiled the damper. She planned. Word came in September. A letter carried by a freight driver from Sioux Falls, addressed to Ragna Solheim, De Smet Settlement, Dakota Territory. Ansel Björka had died in July of a chest illness that had settled in his lungs after the blizzard winter and never cleared. The surgeon had fixed the knee. The lungs were beyond fixing. He was buried in Sioux Falls in a plot the hospital provided for men who died without family to claim them. Ragnar read the letter at the table Ansel had helped her build from scrap lumber in February. She read it twice. She folded it and put it inside the tool roll with the molds and the level. She went outside and dug a test window in the buried line. She checked the joint nearest the cabin. She pressed her thumb against the sealant the way Ansel had taught her, feeling for shift, for softness, for the hairline crack that meant a seal was failing. The joint was perfect. The seal held. The pipe he had helped her build would outlast the man who taught her to build it. That night she fired the stove and opened the damper and listened to the breath in the pipe, the low, steady pull of air through 50 feet of buried clay, and she understood that the sound was the closest thing to Ansel's voice she would hear again. The secondary crisis arrived in October, 2 weeks before the first hard freeze. Silas Voss, who had spent the summer watching 3 more households begin trench work under Ragnar's guidance, had calculated a different response than conversion. He could not deny the system worked. Too many people had felt the floor in Ragnar's cabin. Too many had survived the blizzard because of it. But he could copy it, sell it, and control it. And if he controlled it, the threat to his wood business became a revenue stream instead of a loss. He hired 2 men from Huron who had done ditch work for railroad grading. He bought clay pipe sections from a kiln in Mitchell, machine-made, uniform, cheaper per foot than hand-formed. He offered installations at $40 per household, trenched, piped, and connected in 3 days. The problem was depth. Voss's crews dug to 4 feet because 4 feet was faster and cheaper than 6. At 4 feet on the Dakota prairie, the frost line in a hard winter reached the pipe. And because the machine-made sections were thinner-walled than Ragnar's hand-formed clay, and the joints were packed with plain mud instead of Ansel's 3-layer seal, the first hard freeze in late October cracked 2 joints in the Garrett installation and froze the pipe solid. Garrett's stove lost its outside air supply overnight. The system reverted to room breathing. The floor went cold. But worse, the cracked joints underground were now leaking frigid air into the soil around the pipe, and when the stove pulled hard enough, it drew that leaked air backward through the compromised section and into the stove box colder than if there had been no pipe at all. Garrett came to Ragnar at dawn, furious. "Your pipe is killing my cabin," he said. "It was warmer before Voss put it in." "It is not my pipe," Ragnar said. "How deep did they dig?" "Deep enough. 4 feet." 4 feet is not deep enough. The frost goes past 5 in a hard winter. And the joints, did they seal with clay and cloth and pitch or just mud? Garrett did not know. He had paid $40 and watched two strangers dig a trench and lay pipe and backfill it in 3 days, and he had not asked about the joints because he did not know joints mattered. Ragna walked to Garrett's claim. She dug an inspection window at the 20-foot mark and found what she expected. A cracked section, a mud-packed joint with no wrap and no pitch, and frozen condensation inside the pipe that had blocked airflow entirely. "This is not the system I built," Ragna said. She said it loud enough for the 4 men standing in Garrett's yard to hear. "This is a ditch with bad pipe in it. The depth is wrong. The seal is wrong. The pipe wall is too thin. Whoever sold you this took your money and gave you a frozen hole." Voss heard. He was not at Garrett's yard, but the words reached him before nightfall, because the prairie carried words the way it carried wind, fast, far, and without mercy. He came to Ragna's cabin the next morning. He did not come to the door. He stood at the edge of the buried trench line, which was invisible now, backfilled and grassed over, marked only by the intake hood standing on its stone base. And he called out, "You are telling people my work is bad," Voss said. Ragna came out. She had been forming pipe sections for Marta's extension, a branch run to the bedroom alcove Marta had framed in September, and her hands were wet with clay slip. "Your work is bad," Ragna said. "Garrett's pipe is cracked at the 20-foot joint. The depth is 4 feet. The frost is at 5. The seal is mud. The system is worse than nothing because now his stove is pulling frozen air through a broken pipe instead of pulling cold air through wall leaks. Garrett's cabin is warm enough. Garrett's children slept on the table last January because his floor was freezing. That is what your system gives him again, except now he has paid $40 for it." Voss stepped closer. He was taller than Ragna and broader, and accustomed to the physical advantage that size gave in negotiations with people who owed him money. "You are a girl who dug one trench," he said. "I have laid 50 miles of ditch for freight yards and corrals. Do not tell me my depth is wrong." "Your depth is wrong," Ragna said, "and your seal is wrong, and your pipe is wrong. Dig to 6 feet, use 3-layer seal, fire your own clay thick enough to hold, or stop selling a system you do not understand to people who cannot tell the difference until it fails." She did not step back. She stood with clay on her hands and Ansel's voice in her memory. Invisible work saves more lives than proud work, and she waited. Voss left. He did not fix Garrett's installation. Ragna fixed it herself over 3 days, digging out the compromised section, replacing the cracked pipe with sections she formed and fired from her own clay stock, resealing every joint with the 3-layer method, and backfilling to 6 feet. She charged Garrett nothing. She told him the labor was payment for the lesson. Never let someone sell you a thing they cannot explain. The secondary crisis did not end with the repair. It ended with something quieter. Over the following weeks, every household that had hired Voss's crew came to Ragna and asked her to inspect their installation. She found shallow depth in 3 of 4. She found failed seals in all 4. She repaired 2 and condemned 2 others as unsalvageable without full excavation. Voss lost 4 customers and $40 of uncollected credit. Ragna gained something more valuable than money, the settlement's certainty that she was not selling an idea but defending one, and that the difference mattered when the temperature dropped. By November, 6 households had functioning buried air systems, 3 built under Ragna's direct supervision, and 3 she had repaired from Voss's failures. Marta's was the best of the copies. 6 feet deep, hand-formed pipe, 3-layer seals, with the bedroom branch Ragna had designed using Ansel's spur principle. Ragna was 17 years old. She had not left the claim since her father's funeral. She had buried a mentor and survived a blizzard, and rebuilt a system that a profiteer had tried to destroy through incompetence. She had taught 6 families to listen to their houses instead of feeding their stoves. She had done it alone, without credentials, without authority, without a single person believing her until the proof was undeniable. And winter was coming again. The second winter tested the copies. It was not as violent as the blizzard of January 12th. Nothing would be, in the memory of anyone who had lived through it, but it was steady, persistent, and long. Temperatures settled below zero in early December and did not climb above it for 6 weeks. Wind came in cycles, 3 days of assault, 1 day of quiet, 3 more days. The snow accumulated in layers that compressed under their own weight until the drifts along the north walls of every cabin stood as hard as masonry. Ragna's system ran without failure. She cleared the intake every morning, oiled the damper weekly, and burned fuel at a rate that left her with surplus by February for the first time in her life on the claim. The surplus was small, perhaps a quarter cord, but the fact of it changed something in her posture, in the way she moved through the cabin, in the way she spoke to people who came asking questions. She was no longer surviving, she was managing. Marta's system held as well. The bedroom branch that Ragna had designed kept Nels warm enough to sleep through the night without waking, which Marta said was worth more than the $40 Voss charged for his failures. The joints sealed. The depth held below the frost line. The intake cleared easily because Marta had built it exactly as Ragna specified. Tin hood, wire screen, barrel ring extension, no stone. The 4 households Ragna had repaired after Voss's installations reported mixed results. 2 worked well, the ones where she had replaced entire compromised sections and resealed every joint. 2 struggled, the ones where she had condemned the pipe but the homeowners had refused full excavation and asked her instead to patch what existed. Patching a shallow pipe was like patching a leaking boat with the wrong kind of wood. It held until conditions worsened, and then it held less. You cannot fix bad depth with good sealant. Ragna told a farmer named Strand, who came to her in January, complaining that his patch system was pulling cold. The earth at 4 feet is not warm enough in a hard winter. The pipe needs to be below the frost, and the frost this year is past 5 feet. I told you in October. Digging to 6 feet cost a week of labor, Strand said. Dying costs more. Strand dug. He hired Torvik's crew. 3 men Torvik had organized into an informal labor exchange for trench work, and they reopened the line and dropped it 2 feet deeper over 4 days. Ragna supervised the resealing. By February, Strand's system ran clean and his floor held. The teaching became a rhythm. Every autumn before the first freeze, Ragna held what the settlement began calling the floor sessions. She did not name them. Marta named them, because Marta had a talent for making practical things sound deliberate. The floor sessions worked like this. Ragna visited each household that had a buried system or wanted one. She brought a lit twist of hay and a spool of thread. She held the hay at floor level along every wall and around every stove. She hung thread from the ceiling at body height and watched for lateral movement. She tested the damper pivot, inspected the intake hood, and checked one joint through a test window. Then she told the household what she found. Not gently, not cruelly. With the specificity that Ansel had taught her was the only language materials understood. Your northeast seam has opened a 1/4 inch since last spring. The stove is pulling through it when the wind comes from that direction. Chink it with clay and moss, then check the thread again. If the thread moves, the chinking failed and you need to strip the felt and relay. Your damper pivot is rusted. The tin is too thin. Replace it with heavier stock or it will seize in January and you will lose control of the air supply. Your intake screen is clogged with chaff from the harvest. Clean it now or clean it at 30 below with bare hands. Your choice. She was not liked for this. She was trusted. The distinction mattered on the prairie, where liking was a luxury and trust was infrastructure. By the third winter, 1889 into 1890, 11 households had buried systems. Some were full 50-foot runs with 3-layer seals. Some were shorter, 20 or 30 feet, or smaller cabins or shallower pockets. All were 6 feet deep. All used hand-formed pipe or kiln-fired sections that Ragna had inspected before installation. All had intake hoods built to her specification. The settlement had changed, not in ways a stranger would notice. The cabins looked the same from outside. The chimneys smoked the same. The drifts piled the same. But inside, at floor level, where children crawled and old men sat and women worked on their knees scrubbing and kneading and mending, the air was different. The knife-edge river was gone. The floors held. The stoves burned less and heated more because they were no longer fighting their own appetite for air. Ragna had not just changed the buildings. She had changed the question. Before her, the question every settler asked in October was, how much fuel do I need? After her, the question became, where is my heat going? The first question had one answer, more. The second question had many answers, and each one led to a cabin that worked better with less. Voss's reckoning came in February of 1890 during a 3-day blow that was not a blizzard, but was close enough to remind everyone what a blizzard felt like. His storehouse, the freight yard's main building, where he kept inventory, conducted business, and slept on a cot behind the counter during winter, had the largest stove in the settlement. A cast-iron box stove with a firebox the size of a feed trough, capable of consuming a quarter cord in a single night. Voss kept it fed because Voss had more fuel than anyone. He owned the wood lot. He set the price. He never ran short. The storehouse was also the leakiest building in the settlement. It had been built for storage, not habitation, with plank walls and a tin roof and gaps at the eaves where wind entered freely. Voss had never bothered to chink it because he had never needed to. He had fuel. He could outburn any draft. During the 3-day blow, the wind came from the north at a sustained velocity that turned the eave gaps into channels. The stove pulled air through those channels the way every stove pulled air, by creating low pressure inside the building and letting the atmosphere fill the void. Except the storehouse's gaps were larger than any cabin's, and the stove was bigger, and the pull was proportionally savage. Voss fed the stove until the pipe glowed. The upper storehouse was hot enough to melt frost off the tin roof. The floor was cold enough to freeze the water in the bucket he kept for the horses. He moved his cot onto the counter. He piled blankets on the counter. He burned through half a cord in the first night. On the second day, the stove's draw pulled hard enough through the eave gaps to create a backdraft down the chimney during a wind gust. Smoke filled the storehouse in 30 seconds. Voss opened the main door to clear it, and the wind entered and dropped the interior temperature 20 degrees in a minute. He slammed the door, re-stoked the fire, and sat on the counter coughing while the stove fought the same losing battle it had always fought. Except now Voss could feel it losing. On the third day, with his fuel consumption running at a rate that would cost him $40 in wood by spring, Silas Voss walked to Ragna Solheim's cabin and knocked on the frame beside the canvas door, which she had finally replaced with a proper plank door in September, but which everyone still called the canvas door because the settlement remembered. Ragna opened it. Voss stood in the cold with his coat buttoned to the throat and his hat pulled low and his hands in his pockets. He was not a small man, and he was not accustomed to asking. The asking showed in his posture the way a cracked joint showed in a pipe, a flaw under pressure that only became visible when the load exceeded the design. "My storehouse is burning through fuel faster than I can justify," Voss said. "I know," Ragna said. "The floor is frozen. The stove cannot overcome it." "I know that too. I need He stopped. The word sat in his mouth like something he had never tasted. I need your help. Ragna stood in the doorway of the cabin her father had built, and she had saved. She looked at Silas Voss, who had laughed at her trench on the mercantile porch, who had told the settlement she was burying Winter, who had sold bad copies of her work for $40 each and let the failures speak for themselves, who had stood in her yard and told her she was a girl who dug one trench. She could have refused. She had earned the right. Every person in the settlement would have understood. I will fix your storehouse, Ragna said, but I do it my way, 6 feet deep, my pipe, my seal, and you stand there and watch every joint go in, because you are going to learn what you sold people a system you did not understand. Voss opened his mouth. He closed it. He nodded. And when it is finished, Ragna said, you will tell Garrett and Strand and every man you sold a shallow trench to that the depth was wrong, the seal was wrong, and the price was too high for work that did not hold. Voss looked at her for a long time. The wind pulled at his coat. Snow spun between them in flat spirals that broke apart before they touched the ground. I will tell them, Voss said. He did, not with grace and not with shame that showed, but he told them in the mercantile on a Saturday, with Ragna absent because she had not asked to be present and did not need to be. Garrett heard it. Strand heard it. Torvik heard it and said nothing, because Torvik had learned that silence after a hard truth was more useful than commentary. Ragna installed the storehouse system in 6 days with help from Marta and Peter Lund, a widower from the next section west who had arrived in the settlement in the autumn of 1889 and who had, without being asked, begun hauling clay for Ragna's pipe-forming work after watching her fire sections alone for 2 consecutive Saturdays. Peter Lunde was 31, Norwegian-born from a farm near Lillehammer, and he had the particular quality of a man who understood labor without needing to announce it. He appeared at the clay pit one morning with a barrow he had built from scrap and said, "You need clay at the cabin. I have a barrow and nothing useful to do until my oats go in." He did not ask about the pipe. He did not ask about the system. He hauled clay. He watched Ragna form sections. He listened to her explain the seal to a farmer's wife who was learning the 3-layer method. After 3 weeks, he asked a question. The pitch in the second layer, does it matter if it is pine or spruce? It was the right question. Pine pitch was more flexible and held better in freeze-thaw cycles. Spruce pitch was harder and cracked sooner. The fact that Peter had noticed the difference, had thought about it, and had waited until he had a specific question before asking, told Ragna more about him than a month of conversation would have. Pine, she said. Always pine for buried work. He nodded. He hauled more clay. He came back the next Saturday. The courtship, if it could be called that, because neither of them would have used the word, happened through shared work over the course of a year. Peter learned to form pipe. Ragna learned that Peter could calculate grade by eye with an accuracy that rivaled Ansel's level. They disagreed about backfill technique. Peter preferred tamping in thin layers. Ragna preferred flooding with water and letting freeze-thaw do the compacting, and the disagreement produced a hybrid method that was better than either. They married in the autumn of 1891 at the settlement church, with Torvik as witness and Marta standing beside Ragna with Nels holding a candle that bent in the draft from the church door. Because even churches on the prairie let the wind in, the marriage was not a rescue. Peter did not save Ragna from anything. Ragna did not complete Peter. They were 2 people who understood that work done together lasted longer than work done alone, and that the prairie was large enough to kill any single person's effort, but not large enough to defeat 2 people who measured before they dug. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past, and the work becomes a life instead of a fight. Ragna and Peter had 3 children, a girl named Sigrid, born in 1892, a boy named Halvor, born in 1894, named for the grandfather he would never meet, and another girl named Eli, born in 1897. Each child grew up in a cabin where the floor was warm. Each child learned to carry a candle low along the baseboards in first frost season, the way Ragna had learned from her father in a rented room in Christiania. Listen to the house, Ragna told them. The house will tell you where it hurts if you know how to ask. The buried system spread. Not across the territory. Ragna was not a manufacturer or an evangelist, but through the settlement and into the neighboring claims, wherever someone had been cold enough to listen and patient enough to dig. By 1895, Ragna estimated that 23 households within a day's ride had some form of buried air supply, and of those, 15 had been built under her direct supervision, or by someone she had trained. Marta became the second teacher. She ran floor sessions on the claims east of the settlement while Ragna covered the west. They kept notes, Marta's in her brown paper notebooks, Ragna's scratched into the margins of a ledger Pater had bought in Huron, and they compared findings each spring when the thaw opened the inspection windows. Torvik died in 1893 at 66 of a heart attack while unloading freight in a snowstorm. He was found slumped against his wagon wheel with the reins still in his hand. The settlement buried him on the same hill where Halvor Solheim lay, and Ragna stood at the grave and remembered the $2 silver on the stove top and the freight receipt covered with pencil notes about pipe diameter and joint sealant. Voss remained in the settlement. He did not become a friend. He became something more useful. A man who sold pipe sections at a fair price because he had learned that selling bad work cost more than selling good work, and that a 16-year-old girl had understood this before he did. He never thanked Ragna. He did not need to. The storehouse system ran every winter without failure, and every winter Voss stood a little less tall when Ragna walked past, and the standing less tall was all the acknowledgement either of them required. Peter and Ragna winterized the claim over 5 years until it was, by the standards of the Dakota prairie, comfortable. Not warm the way a city apartment was warm. Comfortable the way a well-made tool was comfortable, functional, honest, built to do what it claimed. The cabin grew. A second room added in 1892, a proper door, a plank floor over the dirt, double felt walls with clay chinking, and the buried air system extended with branches to every room and the outbuilding where the goat, and later 2 cows, and a team of horses sheltered through the worst months. Ragna became the person people sent for when a cabin burned hot but lived cold. She would arrive with Ansel's tool roll on her back and a lit twist of hay in her hand, and she would walk the floor, and she would find the draft, and she would tell the owner where the house was bleeding heat and how to stop it. She charged in trade, clay, labor, linseed, bread, because charging in money felt wrong for knowledge that should have been obvious to everyone who had ever felt cold air on their ankles. She never claimed to have invented anything. What she told people when they asked was that her father had shown her a candle flame, and a Danish brickmaker had shown her a pipe joint, and the prairie had shown her the rest. The children grew. Sigrid had her mother's hands and her grandfather's way of looking at a joint and knowing without measurement whether it was true. Halvor had Peter's patience and Ansel's eye for grade. Eli had Marta's talent for making practical things sound deliberate, and by the time she was 12, she could run a floor session alone with a candle, a thread, and a specificity that made grown men check their chinking before she arrived. Ragna lived to 53. She died in the spring of 1924, in the cabin Halvor had rebuilt on the original foundation, with the original buried pipe still running beneath the floor. The pipe had been repaired twice, once after a tree root cracked a section in 1906, once after the Great Freeze of 1912 tested every joint in the territory, but the seals Ansel had taught her to make held for 36 years before the root found them, and the replacements held after. She died in bed, in a room where the floor was warm, with Pater beside her and the stove breathing from the ground, the way it had breathed since the night she lit it for the first time in December of 1887, and heard the sound of air moving through clay and understood that she had built something invisible that would outlast everything visible she would ever make. 37 winters passed in that settlement, and for 37 winters the pipes breathed. 23 households, 15 built by a girl who started with a spade, a memory, and $14. The method was never patented, never published, never sold beyond the reach of a day's ride. It did not need to be. It needed to work. It worked. One detail lasted longer than the pipes, longer than the cabins, longer than the names carved into the church register. Children in the settlement learned to carry a candle low along the floorboards when the first frost came. They learned it from their mothers, who learned it from Marta Bell, who learned it from Ragna Solheim, who learned it from her father in a rented room before the crossing. They called it listening to the house. None of them remembered why. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature on the Dakota Prairie dropped more than 50 degrees in 5 hours. Elias Torvik, who had survived 5 winters and pulled the dead from frozen sod houses, told a 16-year-old orphan girl that if she wasted a day on her ditch, the storm would take her before spring saw her bones. The storm came. It took Henriksen, who had more coal than any man in the settlement. It took livestock and fence lines and the roof off the church. It buried roads and froze wells and turned the air into a white wall that erased the world. It did not take Ragna Solheim. Morning after the blizzard. Door drifted halfway to the lintel. Snow packed so hard against the north wall it would stand until April. And from the chimney of a 12 by 14 cabin on a quarter section near De Smet, smoke rose straight into a sky so blue and so cold it looked like something that had never been touched. Inside the stove breathed from the ground. The floor held, and 2 children who were not hers slept on the bench with their feet still warm.